Hi, and welcome to Axelbank Reports History and Today. Conversations with America's top nonfiction authors and why their books matter right now. I'm Evan Axelbank, and today we're going to speak with Angelina Fielding, the author of Rough Diamond, The Life of Colonel William Stephen Hamilton, Alexander Hamilton's Forgotten Son. She's an independent historian and artist who was at work on paintings of George Washington. Ms. Fielding, thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you, Evan. It's great to be here.
Before we start our interview, I want to invite listeners to our Patreon page to ask for your support in keeping the show going. Go to patreon.com/AxelbankHistory. We're going to donate part of your contributions to a charity for children's literacy. There almost isn't any doubt that Alexander Hamilton is one of the most influential people in American history, and that his name is one of the most famous. He's on our money. He's the subject of this generation's most famous Broadway show. Unfortunately, he's also well known for the way he was killed, for the way he died. But who are the people who lived in the shadows of people that big? The siblings of presidents, the next door neighbors of senators, or perhaps the sons of founding fathers? What do their inherent connections to history do to their own lives? What influence does that have over their own lives? What is it like to be so intimately connected to someone like Alexander Hamilton? So, Angelina, when and why did you start asking that question about Colonel William Stephen Hamilton?
Thank you, Evan. So actually, my search began with when I was working for my senior paper in school. I was actually working on the relationship between Alexander Hamilton and his mother. And I was studying the dynamics between the two, and I decided to go dig further. And so my search led me through generations of the Hamilton family, and I ended up with Colonel Hamilton, that's William Stephen Hamilton, because I came across a photograph from a painting, and there seemed to be a lot of confusion about this one particular photograph. In fact, if you go online even now, there are some sites that will say this photograph is that of Philip Hamilton, the eldest son who also died in the duel. And there are some sites, few, that will note William Stephen Hamilton as someone who's in the photograph. So this naturally drew my curiosity, and I just thought that, well, there's no way possible that this one painting could be of both the sons. So I started looking more deeper into it, and it actually, I ended up with that senior paper, but it took me off of that, and I spent the next a little over a decade of my life researching William Stephen Hamilton and trying to find out about him.
One of the things that I'm always amazed by is the length of time it takes to research a book. And one of the things our guests on this show have said frequently is how long and how diligent you have to be in order to develop the information you need to make an argument and then turn that argument into a book. So when you reflect on those 10 years, I didn't have this written down, but I want to ask, was that time well spent?
Oh my gosh. So Evan, I definitely have to say it was time very well spent, but it had a lot of challenges. Lots and lots of challenges. For one, I did not have a lot of primary source materials left by the individual that I was working on. That was like the biggest challenge of all. And then, of course, even in the publishing industry, trying to convince publishers to spend money and time and invest in a book that is not necessarily based on someone who's prominent can be tricky business. Fortunately for me, Indiana University Press took a chance on me and allowed me to publish it, but it took me, as I said, over a decade to get to that point. And it was, those 10 years were, there were some moments that were very, very overwhelming, to be quite honest with you, very challenging. Many times that I just would look at his photograph and say, what is your problem? Why couldn't you just have left me a journal at least to work with, something? There was nothing. There was just literally a handful of letters personally written by him. And then half of them were business letters, so it really didn't give me a lot to work with. But fortunately, as I continued with the research, I came across things that his contemporaries had left behind that were very, very tremendously helpful.
And just briefly, where are those letters and documents found? Where did you find
So,
them?
sure. So most of the material connected with Colonel William Stephen Hamilton is at the Wisconsin Historical Society. They hold, I would say, probably 95% of whatever is related to him. And
Alex,
there might be some at Columbia U. Just
gotcha.
a couple of things. Yes.
All right, so let's get into some of the meat here. Alexander and Eliza Hamilton. We both know plenty about them now. Everyone knows
Yes.
about them now because of the great Broadway show. But they had 8 sons between 1782 and 1802. In 1797, William, the subject of this book, number 6, the 6th out of 8, was born when his dad was between 38 and 40. Of course, there's some dispute about when Alexander Hamilton was born, but that means that William was only 7 years old when his famous dad was killed. I'm sure you've done this. I did it. Ron Chernow's biography of Alexander Hamilton is 731 pages, and William is only mentioned on 4 of those pages.
Yes.
And the only mention of any substance beyond the fact that he was born was that he witnessed his dad's funeral and cried during it. What do we know about that scene and the impact that watching his father's funeral had on such a young 7-year-old child?
Okay, so that's a great question. And, unfortunately, we don't have a lot of primary source materials, particularly, I'm going to speak specifically to William Stephen Hamilton. But yes, Ron Chernow's biography by far is one of the most important books to have come out on Alexander Hamilton. There are a few others I can think of, Richard Brookhiser, Thomas Flexner, and so on and so forth. But what I found, and in fact, I was in touch with Mr. Chernow also, who was very generous with his support initially as I was researching. Mind you, my research predates the Hamilton musical. So I was already working on William Stephen Hamilton way before, the Hamilton musical came out and just blew everything open. So as I'm researching, and because that's one of the questions I always get asked, oh, did you just write this book because of the musical? No, in fact, I spent a lot of my time as I mentioned before, over a decade, just trying to find information about this one person. So going back to your question, we don't know exactly what happened. Obviously, we were not there on the scene. Mr. Chernow does a great job of trying to explain it as best as he could, but of course, his biography was not, Alexander Hamilton was the focus of his biography, not William Stephen Hamilton. And in fact, being as young as he was, there's really not a lot of material even I could bring about. I found some information about his early years all the way until he goes to West Point, and then most of the book concentrates on his life in the Midwest. So it's very difficult to, draw together a perfect scene or perfect understanding of what was happening. And I'm by no means a psychologist or a psychiatrist, but you can kind of rely on your own childhood experiences. This is what I did in another interview when someone asked me that question, is that you can kind of gauge by your own experience or other people's experiences when they were children, what they saw, what they may have felt, what they may have experienced, how they may have reacted. So, I mean, I cannot say yes, without a shadow of doubt, I know that he sniffled or whatever, but I can definitely say that that scene must have definitely impacted his psyche at some level, because we will see this as he gets older.
And you argue that William is a good focus for a book because his lifespan, which was from 1797, not to give away the ending, but he died at about 53 years old. It went from 1797 to 1850. And you argue that it's a good focus for a book because it covered so many big events in our nation's early growth. And in fact, you say that understanding a regular old fellow like Colonel William Stephen Hamilton is just as important as understanding a big old fellow like Alexander Hamilton.
Absolutely, Evan. That is something that I believe in. A lot of times, the Midwest is considered flyover country. We just okay, it's there.
And where
There's
do you
some.
live?
I'm currently in Maryland, but
Okay, so not the
I was in
Midwest.
Indiana.
Okay.
Yes, that's where I'm just visiting right now.
Mm.
This is back home. So, but we're just, it's just the Midwest is just there. Obviously there are some major cities like Chicago and so on and so forth. But for the most part, it's just a very laid back kind of place. And as I mentioned, I'm currently in Maryland and I come from the Metro DC area. So that's home for me. So to have relocated to the Midwest, it's a huge difference between the two kinds of places. We're still in America, but it's a different kind of setting. So what I found was that a lot of times the history of the people that were there, the pioneers, for instance, we have a lot of books out there, even movies, and it's in the culture. We see it. There's information about the pioneers, their journey, their life, and so on and so forth. And I just thought that we don't always have to look at great men or women to get a sense of what was happening. We can even look at just the average person and get a sense of the time, perhaps even more so, because you're looking down to the nitty gritty of what an average person's life is like during that period, rather than what an intellectual is doing in his life or what's going on with someone who's really famous. So I wanted to really zero in on that, and I hope I did in my book.
What did you discover about the way the story of America has been told in the early 19th century?
Baking from our childhoods just sticks in the memory, doesn't it? We never set off on holiday without piles of Tupperware, and there'd always be Bakewell slice, flapjacks, and tray baked scones in the boot.
Do you not do that, Lisa?
Yeah, no. Sadly, I do not stack the Tupperware in the back of the car when we go off on holiday.
Oh.
Welcome to Small Ways to Live Well, a new podcast from the Simple Things magazine. Season 2 is a pick-me-up tonic that helps us make the shift from winter to spring. A 6-week suggestion box full of things to note, notice and enjoy about the season. Search for Small Ways to Live Well on your podcast app.
Well, like I said before, I definitely see there's a lot of books out there, and we're talking about early 19th century, not during the Civil War and whatnot, once Lincoln comes into prominence, but even towards the beginning of Lincoln's life, when he's young and he's in Indiana. In fact, he's the subject of my second book that I'm working on right now. But he, even until his time, his early years, where we do have information, but it's not as extensive. For example, not to go away from the topic, but I think it kind of connects. In Lincoln's time, his youth, he spent, he was born in Kentucky, and then he moved over into Indiana, and then he went to Illinois from thereafter. And so Illinois is where we pick up once he's become a lawyer, and we start digging into that part of his life. There's so much information. You will see that in many books, even when they start writing about his presidency and the Civil War and so on and so forth. But if you look further back, if you look at his life, for example, in Indiana, there's hardly anything there. That's because, again, we get stuck in the between not having enough information in terms of primary source materials that you can use to actually draw out a person and what they were about, who they were, how they were living, and so on and so forth. So it's challenging.
One of the things that you argue in the book is that the fame of somebody like an Alexander Hamilton can obscure their private life. And that's kind of, it seems ironic, I guess, because you think someone's so famous, we know everything about them, but you argue that that fame makes it difficult to know the person at a personal and private level. And you do say that most of the children of the founding fathers left very little impact beyond John Quincy Adams, who of course became president himself. So just based on that theory that you have, what do we know about, and what did you discover about the kind of parent that Alexander Hamilton was?
Okay, so yes, and we know what we know about John Quincy Adams is because he ended up becoming famous himself. In fact, he was right alongside with his father. during the Revolutionary period. So, but unfortunately, that's not the case with every child of a famous founding father, or even for that matter, even today, any famous personality. What I found is that Alexander Hamilton was a devoted father. He was a doting father. He loved his children. He, for example, with William Stephen Hamilton, he used to call him his little Arab. And the reason he did that is because William had a tendency of being outside all the time. He loved the outdoors. He was an outdoorsman. When he got into the frontier, he became what we would call the frontiersman. He just loved nature. He loved being outside. In fact, he loved that so much more and preferred it so much more than the business suits that his father wore. He just did not want to dress up and have, just be, even in business meetings, if he could have helped it, he would have shown up barefooted with his, frontiersman clothing or whatever. So that's one of the reasons that he was called in fact, he says his little Arab. That's what Alexander Hamilton said. And, he was very close to his daughter. He loved his daughter, who unfortunately ended up becoming mad after the death of his first son. But he would play the piano with her. He had ordered some birds for her because, she loved birds. So this is giving me the impression that this is a father who clearly loves his children. He may not have had a lot of time to spend with them, obviously, because of his professional life and public life, but nonetheless, he was a devoted father. He loved his children. He taught them many things. There's a scene where I mentioned this in my book, where Elizabeth Eliza Hamilton, his wife, is up in the morning. They're all sitting, and she's putting butter on the bread and giving it to her children as breakfast, and they eat it, and then they go off to study. So these are moments that we may or may not see in other books that are talking about, the politics, and they're talking about, business or what's going on as far as the war or economy and these things. If it's a great book, like with Mr. Chernows, of course, we'll see glimpses of this, but I really wanted that to come out as much as possible.
Talk about Colonel William Stephen Hamilton's upbringing and his path to the military academy. What kind of person is growing up here, and why did he become interested in going to the military academy?
Okay, so Evan, unfortunately, this is the part of his life there's a lot of gaps. What I was able to conclude is, obviously his father was served in the Revolutionary War. His brothers went to West Point. So there's this tendency of, and especially at that time period, typically sons would enlist in the military or something to that effect. And so here we have William Stephen Hamilton, whose father at this point is gone. And if we know anything of that history, we know that there wasn't a lot of money left behind where he could inherit and, just be rich from what his father left him. So he kind of had to fend for himself. And one way to do that was to join the military academy at West Point, and he tried that. Unfortunately, he did not complete his program, and he left early, and then he goes out into the frontier. Why did he stop? Why did he not come back? He supposedly had left and he was supposed to come back, but he never did. Why is that? We don't really know, because the records were destroyed in a fire at West Point. So there's no way to kind of find out what was he doing, what was his education like, how well did he do or poorly did he do. We just know that he was there, and then he left and went to the frontier.
How does his going to the frontier mirror what was happening in the rest of American society, I guess, in that 1810s period?
Mm-hmm. So we know there's the War of 1812, and there's the East Coast is obviously, there's not a lot of space. The population has increased, and there's money issues and so on and so forth. So this is the time period, this early 19th century time period. I was talking about Lincoln earlier too. A lot of young men in particular are coming up, and they're no longer living the life like their predecessors, where, okay, you're born and raised in a farm and you grow up and you just are with the family and you take over the farm, your parents are getting older and so on and so forth. Now we're coming into what I call is the new American mindset, which to this day we carry, which is that you're more entrepreneur types. You want to go out there and conquer the world. You want to have your own thing, your own land, your own business, your own family. You're sort of detaching yourself from the main family and main farm or whatever the occupation may have been. So we see a lot of young men in particular moving towards the frontier, including William Hamilton and including Abraham Lincoln. We see these men moving into the frontier to make, eke out a living for themselves.
Briefly, what were his siblings up to? I know one of them died relatively young because of a duel, like father, like son. Obviously,
Yes.
psychology works in very strange ways sometimes, particularly between fathers and sons. What were his siblings up to? And when I looked it up on Wikipedia real quick, some of those siblings lived a very, very long time, like
Yes.
Eliza did.
Yes, and Philip, for instance, the youngest one, not the eldest, the youngest one did. So briefly, I think a couple of the brothers went into serving in the Jackson administration, which William Hamilton just absolutely abhorred that idea. So he was quite perfectly happy being in the Midwest and not being involved in that. And then I believe Philip, the youngest, I mentioned him again. He was a soft-hearted gentleman, and he kind of took after his mother in the sense of helping out the orphanage and whatnot that she had started, I believe. The one sister, the eldest sister, Angelica, as I mentioned before, she unfortunately became mad. And then the other sister, who was Eliza, was actually very close to William Stephen, and they were very, very close. They bonded very well. And she unfortunately also died down the road, but didn't live quite as long as, the youngest sibling. But yes, they were very close, and Eliza did get married. They did come into the Midwest. She was with her brother, but I think the intention was after her husband died, Sidney Hawley, who she married, and after he died, the plan was for her to come back to the Midwest and live with her brother in Wisconsin, but that did not pan out, unfortunately.
Like lots of kids of politicians, it's easy to wind up in politics. They have a golden name. It's an unmistakable name very often. Certainly the Bush family comes to mind. And I'm not just talking about George W. Bush. I mean, George H.W. Bush has
Yes.
a number of children and nephews and what have you who go into politics or went into politics and are still trying to. And lots of families have that happen. So what was it like back then in terms of politicians' kids getting into politics? Was it sort of the same thing? And how does he start to say, hey, you know what, I'm going to give this a shot?
So, Evan, I know as early as when he moved to when he moved to Missouri, because initially he moved to Missouri. St. Louis was the spot where if you were coming to the Midwest or the frontier at that time, the first spot you hit was St. Louis. You stayed there. And so from there, he's writing a letter to his brother, John Church, and probably, in fact, the only personal letter that you can find, that I found, where he talks about moving to Illinois, and he's describing the soil of Illinois to his brother, and he talks and makes a statement about the politics. In fact, I believe that quote is in the front of my book. And so he already at this age, 18, 19, 20, early 20s, he's already thinking about politics. He has a sense of what he believes in, what he thinks about what's going on in the country and, with politics in general. So we see that early in his life. It may have been even earlier, considering who his father was, but definitely you see it early in his life. I would like to mention, you said, with his name or with that kind of famous name, you should be able to just take on politics and get involved and whatnot. He definitely had an interest in it, but did he have an easy time with it? I argue not, because when he's in the Midwest, this is the time that we have Jackson in office, and particularly in this part of the country, it's a Jackson it's all Andrew Jackson. So you have a lot of Jacksonians. You don't have a lot of Whigs. You don't have a lot of Hamiltonians, and there are no Republicans at this point. So he's coming in, and he's a staunch Whig. He takes after his father, and in my opinion, the only son who does. If you look at the track record of his other brothers, they actually served in the Jackson administration, as I mentioned before. He absolutely refused to. He preferred to go to the frontier and make a living rather than go that way, which he certainly could have. As you mentioned, he could have gone in there and, got another job under the administration of Jackson, but he didn't. He chose to come out to the frontier. But he comes in here, he gets involved in politics, but it's not an easy road by any means. Yet he does fairly well for himself, and we see this in the book, and I explain that.
What did he focus on as a politician?
Well, when he first starts in Illinois, he concentrates. In fact, he fought for a bill to, fix the roads, because the roads at that time, although I would argue in the Midwest, maybe even now, some roads are.
Maybe I was going to say, maybe he could come to Florida and work on it now.
We could use him today.
Yeah, no kidding.
But he has a law in place which actually goes in effect and lasts for a little bit, and then it's canceled out. And that's to concentrate on fixing the roads and building decent highways and whatnot. So he's very interested in that because when he first came in as a surveyor. So that's his background, very similar to Lincoln. That surveying is a major way that young men can get in and get into the frontier. That's and a lot of them do, including William Stephen.
We know that his father was a top aide to George Washington in the military, and Colonel William Stephen becomes an aide de camp to a commander. So how did he wind up in the military and doing something very similar to what his own dad did?
So he actually serves as a volunteer in the militia. And we have some, we have wars going on in the Midwest at that time. So we've got the Winnebago War, we've got the Black Hawk War, and he participates in these wars. In the Black Hawk War, he serves as a spy for the Army. But again, he's still volunteer militia. And before all of this, if I may go back a little, in the 19th century, early 19th century, we have a visit from a Revolutionary War hero, and that's Marquis de Lafayette. When he comes, he's traveling the U.S., he comes through New York and whatnot. When he lands here in the Midwest, he is brought together, and William Stephen is presented to him by a letter from Governor Coles, and he's introduced as Alexander Hamilton's son. And by Lafayette's own admission, he resembles his father. He cries and he embraces him. It's a very emotional scene because we know the relationship between Lafayette and Hamilton, the father. And William Stephen ends up basically being his aide de camp, if you will, or his translator or his secretary for the duration that he's here, because he's very fluent in French that he learned himself. He's completely self-taught. That's William Stephen. And he learned French from his father's books and whatnot. So here he is translating for his father's friend at this stage. And they spend some time together.
How does that experience go? Does he like it? Does he like being in the military? And, how did he wind up heading even further west, which is another pattern that we see throughout American history, even into the 20th century?
Yes. So I believe he had a military instinct. When we think about Alexander Hamilton and the letter that he wrote before he landed here, before the war took off, he's yearning for something to happen, right? He wants to prove himself as a young man. And so William Stephen is no different. He has this desire to prove his ability. He's very much deeply in awe of his father, no doubt about it, because he applies whatever principle. Mind you, his father died when he was 7. So it's not like Alexander, Philip the eldest had the benefit and advantage of having his parents in his life and he was older. But William Stephen does not, because his father's already gone. However, he has memories and he has things, I'm sure, that his mother told him and his siblings told him and other people told him about his father that he really holds close to his heart. I mentioned that earlier in the interview. Somehow that death scene does affect him because he carries it through his life. And whether you look at his politics, whether you look at his military career, whether you just see it in his physical appearance, or whether you see the way that he stands up, he goes against the grain in everything that he does. If you look at politics, it would be easy. His own brother, again, I mentioned this over and over again, but his own brothers worked for Jackson. He decides he wants to be a Whig, and he is a Whig all the way through. If you look at, you can live in New York, you can use your name, and you can do something. No, he decides he wants to. So he's always going against the grain. And in my opinion, much like his father.
I was just going to say that.
Yes, yeah. He's got this sheer will and determination and just, I'm going to do this my way kind of a thing. And so he carries that all the way to California. You mentioned California. This is what he's doing all the way to his death. This is how he lived.
And he went there in 1849, and it's just amazing how his story really does, as you argue, mirror that first half of the 19th century.
Yes. If you read the chapters on the journey itself, I've had people tell me they just never realized how grueling that journey was. We see it in documentaries, movies, and so on and so forth, but I really wanted to highlight. And it's funny because we're experiencing the COVID pandemic and so on and so forth, and here he is, he's journeying. He doesn't have the medical advantages that we do, and they've got all kinds of diseases, Evan. You're talking about cholera, dysentery, things that we probably haven't even heard of, or we've forgotten about.
Glad to have forgotten about them.
Yeah, exactly. So he somehow manages to make it through. And what's really sad for me is that he goes through all of this, gets there, and barely lives the year out, and then he's gone. And it's such a shame, such a tragedy, in my opinion.
Never got the gold.
Yeah,
never got the gold. Did you go? I'm sure you've been to his grave site.
Actually, believe it or not, I haven't been able to so far.
Wow.
But it's on my bucket list.
What do you what would you, when you get there one day, which you will, what are you going to look for, and what are going to be the things that you kind of say to yourself as you stand there in front of the gravesite of this person who you've studied and spent 10 years learning about?
So I can tell you, I've been to a lot of grave sites. I know that might sound morbid, but in my line of work, we often do that. I've been to Gettysburg and all kinds of, places, which is a very humbling and sobering experience. And I remember growing up as a kid being scared of ghosts and whatnot. So you have this thing in your head. But now, doing the work that I do, I'm literally I could be standing in front of Lincoln's mother's grave, and I spent a lot of time just soaking in the atmosphere, because they've tried to keep it very similar to their time. So, in fact, when I write, I try to visit as many places as possible where my subject lived, because it gives me a sense of their time and place when I'm writing.
Why is it important to immerse yourself even in a place that they had never been, which is their own gravesite? Well, I guess they may have been there because it was on their property and things like that. But why is it important for a historian to immerse themselves in just the physical space that you essentially now occupy with your subject?
So, when we look at actors, for example, you've got good actors that I don't want to mention any names, but you've got good actors, and then you've got great actors. Great actors, in my opinion, of course, this is all my opinion, great actors, in my opinion, are the ones that go the extra mile. They don't just stop after reading the script and do the role. They will actually go beyond reading the script, and some of them, I will mention the name. Daniel Day-Lewis, for example, that man will immerse himself in his character. So when you are watching him on film, you think that is who that subject looked like. So historians are the same way. We've got some good historians, and we've got some great historians. I by no means am I saying I'm great. I'm just making a point that, if you look at the work of David McCullough, for instance, he goes that extra step. He tries to present his information in a way that you're actually experiencing what's happening and it's all through his words. And his words are coming not just from his mind, but from the senses that he's collecting as he's doing his research. So the same principles apply to me. As much as possible, I try to be in that space because it really definitely makes a difference, in my opinion. You can sense that standing in front of their grave, that's almost like coming to a completion. That's your closure with your subject that, okay, this is who I spent my life on in many cases, and here he is, and here she is, or whatever the case may be. And it just, I don't know, for me personally, it's just a very, it's just a moment that needs to happen for that writer, for that historian.
Do you think you'll do like an epilogue or something like that, or a second ending after you get a chance to do that?
I will at least try to have an article out there or something as my closure article, because, with the COVID, it's been very difficult to travel as much, but I hope to visit him. Two
quick wrap up questions with Colonel Stephen before I ask you a couple other things. So just briefly, why didn't he get married?
That's a mystery question, Evan.
All right.
He just never married. My thinking is it's possible that maybe he just, growing up, he saw what happened with his mother, who absolutely loved her husband. But obviously, Alexander Hamilton was long gone. So maybe he just felt that, not knowing the kind of life he was living, he had no way of knowing that he would live, 50 onwards. For all he knew, he may have been thinking, I'll die at 25, because he's on the frontier and so on and so forth. So it could be a lot of reasons why he decided, hey, it's better just to be single, live my life, and not ruin somebody else's life.
What was amazing is that Eliza outlived him. Eliza lived to 18. I mean, that's incredible. Eliza lived to 1854. And it's interesting. I remember the opening of Chernow's book is that all these major politicians of the 1850s at one point were gathering around her because they couldn't believe they were actually touching somebody who had played such a big role in the revolution. Do we know anything about how she reacted to her son's death in 1850, 4 years before she would pass on?
Yes, actually, Evan, I mentioned that in my book. In fact, when William Stephen died, the siblings, all of them agreed not to tell the mother because they were afraid that if she found out, she would definitely go. That's because she was very close to her. In fact, many say she was the closest. He was her closest child to her. She loved him. She adored him. She's here in her 80s, Evan, traveling from New York down the Ohio River or coming to the Midwest to see her son, I don't even know if people want to do that today with the planes and whatnot. But here she is. She's doing this. She absolutely loved her son, and it would have broken her heart. Absolutely. I have no doubt in my mind.
So she never knew.
Yes, she went to her grave not knowing that her son had passed away way ahead of her. She never knew.
You ask very clearly in the book, did he make life better or worse? Did Colonel William Stephen make life better or worse for the people who came after him for the subsequent generations? Obviously, historians are still arguing about Alexander Hamilton on that, although some have come down on one specific side. But what can you answer about that? Did Colonel William Stephen Hamilton make life better or worse for those who came after him?
Well, Evan, I think that's the reason I asked that question is because I wanted people who were reading my book to kind of make that decision for themselves. I wanted them to read this life story of a person who wasn't, a huge public figure, and the life that he lived and what he went through, and kind of find if they relate to his life or they don't. I personally found myself relating to him on many different levels. He went through a lot of challenges. You think, oh, he's Alexander Hamilton's son. He must have had it easy. Everything must have just, given. No, it was quite contrary in many cases. In many cases for him, the name Hamilton was not, a plus point. So I personally feel that Colonel William Stephen Hamilton stands out on his own as an example of his generation. And in my opinion, that generation is, the beginning of the American man or woman, or the mindset that we have today, that entrepreneurial spirit, that go-getters, that, we're not afraid, we're going to go out there and conquer, or we're going to be productive, or we're going to build something. Those types of ideas is how I see him. And that's what we see today.
We have done books on this show that are 600-700 pages.
Oh,
this book is a bit shorter than that. Did you keep it relatively short? I think it's about 110 pages or so. Did you keep it short for a reason? Is that all you needed? Was there a strategy behind that? Or would you have made it longer if there were more primary sources?
Oh, absolutely. No doubt about it. I would have probably had a 1,200-page book if I had the primary source materials. Unfortunately, I did not. As I mentioned earlier, there's only a handful of personal letters written by him, and half of them are business letters. So he did not leave a lot of information. And what helped me to put this book together is basically contemporary accounts and, some personal accounts from his siblings and things like that.
Are some books, well, let me just say, I love long books, and I love picking up an 800-page biography. I really do. The Robert Caro books on Lyndon Johnson are just about my favorite. If not, well, they are my favorite. And I've read the McCullough books, and I've read the Chernow books, and I've read the Doris Kearns books.
Yes.
But there is a lot of dispute among historians, both popular historians and academic historians, about the length of books. Certainly publishers have their preferences. What do you think? Are some books too long?
Well, I think there's definitely a requirement. Like if you're writing a scholarly book, there's a different set of challenges. If you're writing one for, as you said, popular book, there's a different set of requirements. So it just depends on what you're writing, what is your style, I have an academic background as a historian. So people think that I should be writing scholarly books. In fact, that was one of the challenging things with this book, getting it published, is that some of the publishers didn't think it was scholarly enough. Some of them, I actually had, here's a secret. One publisher who accused me of being in love with William Stephen Hamilton, and you're just, and I thought, oh my gosh. So
what a sexist, disgusting comment to make, if I may say.
Yes, but it was made. Evan, if you ever want to do an interview with me, aside from my book, like talking about all the nitty-gritty details of the background scenes, then sure. There was a young lady
But that's just an offensive comment. I mean, that's just offensive.
And it was made to me, yes. And I said, oh my gosh, but how could you even say? I was so distraught. Honestly, I was very distraught. I remember crying that day and saying, I try to be as, clear and unbiased in my writing. But I was presenting it. If you read it, you will see it has, at least I've been told, it has a more storytelling element rather than a scholarly element. And that's what I was going for, because those are the kind of books I enjoy, despite the fact that I'm a scholar. But yeah, that comment was made, and there were others that were made, but it's a long journey. That's why it took me as long as it did to publish this small little book. It's not 800 pages, but it was a long journey for Colonel Hamilton to come into being. But I was mentioning, there was a young lady just I think yesterday or day before on Twitter who I think is starting her bachelor's program in history, and she said, something to the effect of what am I looking for? And I told her, basically, you need to have true grit if you're going to make it as a historian. You need to absolutely be passionately in love with history and not let anything, if you're going in it for the money, good luck with that. I mean,
I hope you make a lot of money.
Maybe you can make professorship and have that. But if you're going independently, everything that I do is completely independent. There's no backing, financial or otherwise. So it's very difficult. But that's why I told her, you have to be passionate about what you're doing. Otherwise, it's not going to work.
I'm sorry that someone said that to you. That is something that wouldn't even have occurred, Evan, to say. That is disgraceful.
I swore I would never share that, and here I am sharing it with the whole world. Thanks, Evan.
There you go. 7 billion people hopefully will download it and
Oh
the
my
whole world can
gosh.
hear it.
Can we cut that part out?
Yeah, no, we're leaving that in. Uh, Tell us about you. Of all the people we've had on the show, 83 people now, you're, I think, the 83rd or 84th, somewhere in there. You have one of the most interesting backgrounds, without a
Oh gosh.
question, as an artist and a historian. I thought that was fascinating. How do you find that art and history go together?
So, Evan, I came to that conclusion after a long haul. I was struggling because I kept, I love painting. I've loved that ever since I was a child. Not just painting, but, I make handmade journals, things like that. So I've always been a very creative individual. I've loved to paint ever since I was a little girl. And so that was always happening while life was going on. And then, of course, I went to college and I'm trained in as a historian, but my passion was also with art. So that's all self-taught. I'm a self-taught artist. So I remember, I think it was back in 2013 or something, and I was struggling. I was thinking, okay, if I put out my paintings there, and then I'm also writing, people are going to get confused because I kept getting this feedback from people. Well, actually, I had one person say, "What are you? Are you a historian or are you an artist? What are you?" And I said, "Oh my gosh!" I said, "I'm both." And they said, "You can't be both. You can't be both. You can either be one or the other." And I said, "Really? Well, Michelangelo was a lot more than just an artist. He was a
Can't be
sculptor
both.
too.
I don't understand.
Da Vinci was
People
more
say
than just an
people say very
artist."
strange
So,
things to you.
yeah, so I'm thinking, and actually it really hurt me because I thought for a long time, I was like, oh my gosh, am I like confusing the public? Will they not want to buy my art, or will they not want to buy my books because they think I'm just two different, jack of all trades, master of none kind of a thing? And then I thought, well, what about the Renaissance masters? They mastered so many things. And even if you think about Thomas Jefferson, okay, we think of him as a politician, but he was doing other things. Look at George Washington. He was doing other things. And, these men are celebrated. There are women, too, that are celebrated for doing multiple things. So why should I think differently of myself and cut out my art or cut out my history or cut out my writing just because someone is saying, hey, you can't be doing all things? So I decided I'm going to do what I love to do. And I combined my two passions of history and art. So now you'll see early American art in my paintings, and you'll see early American history in my writings. And so I think I just love that. I'm glad I
Excuse me,
separated.
but we have presidents of the United States who play far too much golf, and no one ever demands that they give up their golf other
Thank you,
than their
Evan,
political
for
opponents.
saying that. Oh my gosh, I love you. Thank you for saying
I
that.
mean, Dwight Eisenhower played so much golf that the next president found golf cleat marks in the floorboards of the Oval Office. So
There we
let's all get a
go.
grip
I'm
here.
going to play this clip, like I'll put it on my website. So if anyone ever says, I'll just have you speaking for me. Thank you.
I mean, I don't even know what to say about the things people say to you. That is
Yes.
wild.
I had so many interesting comments.
What are you working on now? Tell us about Lincoln. Tell us about the artwork you're working on too. So start with your book on Lincoln. If say only as much as you want to say, and then I want to hear about your George Washington paintings, which you've announced on your website too.
So Evan, you probably shouldn't have asked me that question.
Be quick. I'm just kidding. Go ahead.
Right. So actually I have a little bit of a bad news, and I don't know how this is going to end up. But I started researching Lincoln again. I'm working on his early years in Indiana when he was a young boy. And oh my gosh, I spent so much time, years, researching, getting all my notes together, everything. So earlier, I think when we were just talking, I told you that I had had a lot of things happen this past year. One of them was that, I went through some personal issues. And because of that, I'm here in my hometown. I guess I'm in Maryland. And when I was coming here, I shipped a box full of all my research notes, my books, my secondary source. Yes, you know where I'm going. I shipped it out to myself from Indiana thinking, okay, well, I'm recovering because, okay, I had surgery, which is why I'm here. I'm recovering with my family. And I thought, well, I won't be able to do much, so I'll just work on my manuscript. And well, unfortunately, I have not been able to do that because my entire box of research materials were gone. There's just, I don't know what happened. A particular federal agency was the one I used. I won't take any names to ship my items out to myself. And somehow that box got opened up. All my things were taken out, and 2 pairs of dirty shorts and a multivitamin bottle. That also a child's multivitamin bottle, those gummy bears. That was put into the box, and the box was shipped out to me. So when I opened it, I was like, oh my gosh, where are all my books? Where's everything? And that was almost 2 months ago. And I'm still going back and forth with them, trying to find my stuff so that I can write my book.
Please keep us updated on that.
Oh my gosh.
Tell us about your George Washington art.
Okay. So that's the other thing. My plan was this year to just completely dedicate myself to painting portraits of Washington. I was studying his face from all angles, like all of the beautiful paintings by the greats and his, death mask, everything, because I wanted to memorize every single angle of his face. And that was going really well. But then, of course, like I said, I had the personal things happen. And so I had to put that on hold. Since I've been here, which it's been about a month now, I've been waiting for my LinkedIn materials. In the meantime, with everything that's happening with Ukraine and Russia, there was a while ago, I think a couple of years ago, maybe, I had written an article. It was the difference between a politician and a statesman. And because, people use the 2 words simultaneously, and I thought there is a distinct difference between the two. And so when I was watching or hearing about the news, and I thought, it's my opinion, no one has to agree, but I find Zelensky being very close to the statesman that I was talking about in my article. A patriot. Some can say he's making mistakes, whatever, but that was my opinion. So I decided I'm going to paint a portrait of him, and that's what I've been working on. It's coming along okay, I think.
Looking forward to seeing that. Make sure you post that. Another thing I want to ask you about is handmade stationery. You make handmade stationery. Yes. Why is that something that we still need? And even in today's day and age where we can write everything down on a computer and stick it into a file somewhere, what is it about handmade stationery that makes you, the historian, go, this is something we all need to have in our homes?
Thanks, Evan. Well, actually, it's the history behind the material that I use. So when I'm making these handmade stationeries and, journals, I'm trying to use paper, fabric, textile, everything, whatever I can think of, old coupons and, museum tickets and things like that to bring it together in this journal. It's like a keepsake book of all the memories. There's so many things that we used to have, let's say, not to date myself, but 80s and 70s, things that we don't normally see.
We know about the 80s. We know about them. We know
about. They go to a thrift shop or something, and they maybe come across something, but you don't go and find these things in a regular store, right? You can't just. Nowadays, I know they'll do it in clothing and things like that, but I'm talking about the actual original pieces. So my idea behind that was just to, put together a journal where you can insert things that are meaningful to you, that you enjoy, that you love, but you may not find it easily anymore. They may be collections that you already have, or they may be things that you find. So there's a place, and the journal part is, of course, the writer in me. You have to have some space where you can journal something about that object, or just write or draw or paint or sketch. So that was the idea behind that. Incidentally, as I was researching LinkedIn, he too made handmade journals. So of course, there's that. And boy, was he, can you imagine in his time trying to find some paper to sew together to make a journal?
You had to make it. You had to make it. Couple quick ones here for you. Sure. Who would you do a book on today that's in the same category as your Rough Diamond, as Colonel William Stephen Hamilton? Who's around today who you think is in the same category, who you would like to do a book on as someone who's growing up in the shadow of a major politician, like a president or a senator or a governor or something like that, or another famous person?
Oh gosh, Evan, my mind is so stuck in the past. I don't even look at the contemporaries. I would have to think about that. All right. I'm so sorry. Yeah.
You can get back to us. If you could snap your fingers, how would you change the way history is researched and told?
I think from my own personal experience, I would like to see the publishing industry and some of the people who are already in the business, writers, authors, whatever. I would like to see them give us smaller fish a little bit of a chance, an opportunity. I actually was very fortunate, and if I may mention this, Mr. Richard Brookhiser is a fantastic and phenomenal person. And I hope he doesn't hear this because he'll kill me. But no, he's such a humble person. He is so sweet. He helped me in so many ways, not by necessarily, okay, I'll take your stuff and give it to someone so it can get published, but just the encouragement and support that he provided. I can remember days that I was distraught from all of this, and he was just like, no, keep going, keep going, keep going. It's like a cheerleader for me, just people like that, people who've been in the industry. It would be nice to see more of Richard Brookhisers out there.
I can tell you a story about Richard Brookhiser myself.
Okay.
When I was first getting involved in history Twitter and first discovering that there were all these ways to access or to interact with these people whose books I read, and I've read hundreds and hundreds of them, Richard Brookhiser was one of the first people who I followed and who followed me back and who I had discussions with. And so it is no stretch to say that he inspired me to keep going with my history habit and going from reading into discussing books online and now podcasting about it. So thanks to Richard.
Absolutely. Yes, Evan, he is the most humble person. I say this all the time in all my circles, whatever small or big they are. He just, because when you think about a person in his position, okay, nationally known, internationally known, he does not have to give me 1 second of his time, which is no doubt so valuable, right? But when I approached him, just like you, I just reached out to him. And mind you, my entire grad school, my bachelor's, everything, I was reading, his books are in all of my papers because I was always referencing him. But, I feel that a person like Richard Brookhiser is such a gem to people like us because, first of all, he doesn't have to give us the time of the day, and yet he does. Not only does he respond to you, but he may even on occasion check in and say, okay, hey, what's going on with that? Or what happened with this? And when you speak about Twitter, every time if I'm doing something, he's always retweeting my stuff. He's, his generosity is just unbelievable. He's not getting anything out of me or anyone else. He's just doing it because of who he is. And of course, I just want to interject. His wife is a beautiful person. But anyway, sorry, I had to say that in there.
It's amazing to see that he's not the only one on History Twitter. Yes. And it's been a wonderful community and is really the best.
You are, for example.
That's very nice.
You put this tweet out and I was trying to pull your leg and you turned around and said, hey, I'll take you up on it. I'll read your book. We'll do this interview. So you didn't have to do that. You could just have, who am I? You could have just passed me by, but you did. Here you are spending your valuable time with me. So I truly appreciate that. I would like to see more of that, because there's so many people like me who are undiscovered or what, but we're doing good work and we just need, I'm not kissing a canvas and selling it for $1 million, but my work is worth something. And that ought to have there ought to be someone who's saying, okay, let these people also have an opportunity.
Well, 3 cheers to all that. And we're thrilled to have you on the show. And that's one of the things that I love doing on our show is having people as big and as famous as David Marinis and as Annette Gordon-Reed, who are both great friends of the show, and to having independent historians like you. And you're not the first we've had. We've had probably at least a half dozen independent historians, and we have
That's
more
terrific.
scheduled. So we're very glad to have all stripes of historians on our show. Last question. You say that William is the quintessential American because by studying him, we can learn about ourselves. So what did you learn about yourself from researching Colonel William Stephen?
Thank you, Evan, for that question. I learned that I am motivated. I'm not a quitter. and life has had lots of challenges for me, but I'm going to keep moving forward. I'm going to keep going, even if it's one step at a time, and there are baby steps. Nonetheless, we must move forward. We must do, whatever gifts that we have, we should use them to be productive. And as I just mentioned with the whole, give opportunities to others and help someone else. I try to do that in my own life. I mean, I may not be a big fish, but whatever I can, however it is, I think, humanity is the end goal. And if you lose that because you're too busy, or you're too rich, or you're too powerful, or you're whatever, then what is life after all? So I'd like to say that, keep the heart, keep going, keep pushing forward. And that's I saw that in William Stephen. That's who he was.
I can say without a doubt that this is one of my favorite interviews we've ever done on the show. Top 1, 2, or 3. Angelina Fielding, or A.K. Fielding, as it says on the cover of her book, the author of Rough Diamond, The Life of Colonel William Stephen Hamilton, Alexander Hamilton's Forgotten Son. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Evan, and thank you to your audience for listening to me.
Check out the book. Check out her website, TrahansTreasures.com. She's on Twitter at AK Fielding. I want to invite listeners to our Patreon page to ask for your support in keeping the show going. Go to patreon.com/AxelBankHistory. We will donate part of your contributions to a charity for children's literacy. And thank you for listening to Axel Bank Reports History and Today, conversations with America's top nonfiction authors and why their books matter right now. Check us out on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Axel Bank History. We update those with clips from the show, guest announcements, and book recommendations. We'll see you next time. Thanks.